The great hall of the Galactic Council stretched for miles in every direction, its crystal walls reflecting the light of 1,000 stars. Ambassador Thyron of the Kethmori stood at the center podium, his tall blue frame trembling with emotions. His species rarely showed in public. Around him, representatives from 300 worlds watched in silence as one of the galaxy's most powerful beings prepared to beg. Captain Marcus Webb sat in the human section, a small cluster of chairs that had been added only recently to the ancient chamber. For 2,000 years, humans had been denied entry to this council. The other species called them too violent, too unpredictable, too dangerous for civilized company. Now those same species were about to ask for their help. Thyron's voice echoed through the chamber as he began his speech. The Kethmori had been the galaxy's peacekeepers for 3 millennia. Their advanced technology and disciplined military had kept order across 800 star systems. They had ended wars with a single ship, toppled tyrants with a squad of soldiers, and brought peace to countless worlds. They were the guardians of civilization itself, but now they were losing. The Ravagers had appeared 6 months ago from the dark space between galaxies. They were unlike anything the Kethmori had ever faced. Where most species fought for resources or territory, the Ravagers seemed to fight for the simple joy of destruction. They consumed everything in their path, turning entire worlds into lifeless husks before moving on to the next system. The Kethmori had sent their finest fleets to stop them. Each battle had been fought with precision and honor, following the ancient rules of warfare that had kept the galaxy stable for so long. They had used minimal force, targeted only military installations, and always offered terms of surrender before attacking. The Ravagers had destroyed them utterly. 17 worlds had fallen in 6 months. The Kethmori's greatest admiral was dead, his flagship torn apart by weapons that seemed to grow stronger with each battle. Their most advanced technology had been analyzed and countered within hours. Their most careful strategies had been anticipated and turned against them. Thyron's voice cracked as he described the fall of Kethmor Prime's outer colonies. Billions of beings had been consumed, their bodies broken down into raw materials for the Ravager war machine. The survivors spoke of creatures that seemed to adapt to every weapon, every tactic, every strategy the Kethmori could devise. Webb watched the other ambassadors as Thyron spoke. The Velinari looked uncomfortable, their tentacles writhing with anxiety. The Zephyrians had dimmed their natural glow to almost nothing. Even the proud hegemony representatives seemed smaller in their seats. Everyone in the chamber knew that if the Kethmori couldn't stop the Ravagers, no one could, except perhaps the humans. Thyron turned toward the human section, his large eyes focusing on Webb with an expression that mixed hope and disgust. The Kethmori had studied human history extensively after first contact. They knew about the wars, the weapons, the countless ways humans had found to destroy each other. It was why they had refused to let humanity join the galactic community. Now, that same violent nature was their only hope. The ambassador's request was careful and diplomatic. He spoke of humanity's unconventional warfare capabilities and their unique strategic thinking. He mentioned their innovative approaches to conflict resolution and their adaptability under pressure. He never used the words "the entire." Chamber was thinking violence, brutality, savagery. The offer was extraordinary. Full membership in the Galactic Council, immediate access to advanced technology, territorial rights to any system they could claim, and a voice in shaping the future of galactic civilization. All they asked in return was for humanity to deploy their military forces against the Ravagers. Webb listened to the translated whispers from other delegations. Some species were horrified at the idea of unleashing humans on any enemy. Others argued that desperate times called for desperate measures. A few suggested that perhaps the Ravagers and humans would destroy each other, solving 2 problems at once. The Kethmori had tried everything else. Their quantum computers had run millions of battle simulations, all ending in defeat. Their best scientists had analyzed Ravager technology for weeks, finding no weaknesses. Their most experienced generals had studied every known military doctrine, finding nothing that could stop an enemy that learned from every encounter. but humans, Theron explained with obvious distaste, didn't follow known military doctrine. They fought in ways that made no sense to civilized minds. They used weapons that seemed designed purely to cause suffering. They employed tactics that prioritized destruction over efficiency. The chamber fell silent as Theron finished his speech. The greatest military force in the galaxy was admitting defeat and asking for help from a species they had always considered barbaric. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Webb stood slowly, feeling the weight of hundreds of alien eyes upon him. He had been expecting this moment for weeks. Ever since the first reports of Ravager attacks had reached Earth, the human government had been preparing for this exact scenario, knowing that eventually the galaxy would need their particular skills. His response was brief and direct. Humanity would consider the Cathemori's request, but they would do so on their own terms. If the galaxy wanted human help, they would get human methods. There would be no restrictions on weapons, no limitations. On tactics, no rules of engagement beyond the complete destruction of the enemy. The chamber erupted in worried chatter. Several delegations demanded clarification on what exactly humans meant by complete destruction. Others wanted assurances that human forces would respect galactic law and civilian populations. Webb's answer silenced them all. He looked directly at Theron and spoke words that would be recorded in galactic history. "You want us to be monsters. Time to show you what monsters can do." As the session ended, Webb transmitted his report to Earth. The galaxy's peacekeepers had failed, and now they were calling for the galaxy's warriors. The Cathemori thought they knew what they were asking for, but they had no idea what they were about to unleash. 3 weeks later, the first human fleet would arrive at the Cathemori homeworld, and the galaxy would learn the difference between fighting a war and winning one. The first human fleet arrived at the Cathemori homeworld 3 weeks after the council meeting, and immediately the aliens knew they had made a terrible mistake. Where Cathemori vessels were sleek and beautiful, designed like works of art that happened to carry weapons, human ships looked like weapons that happened to carry people. They were ugly, functional, and covered in enough firepower to level a small moon. General Patricia Stone stepped off the transport ship and onto the pristine platform of the Cathemori Military Academy. The building around her was a masterpiece of architecture, all flowing lines and peaceful gardens designed to inspire calm contemplation. It was the kind of place where warfare was studied like philosophy, where battles were planned like chess games, where violence was a last resort applied with surgical precision. Stone had been expecting something like this. The Cathemori were famous throughout the galaxy for their civilized approach to everything, including war. They had rules for combat, protocols for surrender, and treaties governing acceptable weapons. They fought like they were afraid of breaking something valuable. The human general was met by High Commander Veltar, the Cathemori's most senior military officer. He was tall and elegant, with the kind of bearing that came from centuries of victory through superior technology and careful planning. His uniform was spotless, his posture perfect, and his expression barely concealed his horror at what he saw. Stone was shorter, stockier, and scarred from battles that had left their mark on her body and soul. Her uniform was practical rather than decorative, designed for function rather than appearance. She carried weapons that the Cathemori would have considered barbaric, and she wore them like they were part of her body. The briefing room was filled with Cathemori officers, all of them studying the human general with the kind of fascination usually reserved for dangerous animals. They had prepared detailed presentations about Ravager capabilities, tactical analyses of previous battles, and carefully calculated projections of optimal force deployment. Stone listened to their reports with growing amazement. The Cathemori had been fighting the Ravagers for 6 months, and they still thought they were dealing with a conventional enemy. They talked about measured responses and proportional retaliation, as if they were facing another civilized species rather than a swarm of planet-eating monsters. When they showed her their advanced weaponry, Stone asked a question that made the entire room uncomfortable. Why would you want to fight the same enemy twice? The Cathemori weapons were designed to disable rather than destroy, to neutralize threats with minimal damage to infrastructure or personnel. They were the tools of a species that viewed war as a temporary inconvenience rather than a fight for survival. Stone explained the human approach to warfare in terms that made the Kethmori officers visibly pale. Humans didn't fight to win battles, they fought to win wars. They didn't seek to disable their enemies, they sought to eliminate them. They didn't worry about acceptable casualty rates because they understood that the only acceptable casualty rate was 0 for your side and total for theirs. The cultural briefing went even worse. High Commander Veltar attempted to explain the rules of galactic warfare, the protocols that had kept conflicts civilized for millennia. There were restrictions on planetary bombardment, prohibitions against certain types of weapons, and agreements about the treatment of prisoners and civilians. Stone listened patiently, then asked about the Ravagers' compliance with these same rules. The silence that followed was answer enough. The Kethmori had been fighting a total war with limited war tactics, trying to defeat an enemy that followed no rules while handicapping themselves with restrictions the enemy didn't share. When asked about acceptable casualty rates for the coming campaign, Stone responded with a question that would haunt Kethmori strategists for years: acceptable to whom? The concept of acceptable losses was foreign to a species that had never faced true existential threat. They fought wars where defeat meant negotiation, not extinction. The human general outlined her strategy for dealing with the Ravagers, and with each word the Kethmori officers looked more disturbed. There would be no surgical strikes, no careful targeting of military installations, no attempts to minimize collateral damage. The goal was not to defeat the Ravagers, but to erase them from existence. Stone explained that human military doctrine was based on a simple principle: if something was trying to kill you, you killed it first and killed it so thoroughly that it could never try again. The Kethmori had been trying to fight a careful, civilized war against an enemy that wanted to eat them alive. The meeting ended with half the Kethmori command staff requesting immediate transfers to other systems. They claimed they were needed for defensive operations, but Stone knew the truth. They were terrified of what they had invited into their war. The remaining officers tried to maintain their composure, but Stone could see the fear in their eyes. They had spent their entire lives believing that civilization was about restraint, about finding peaceful solutions to conflicts, about using the minimum force necessary to achieve objectives. Now they were working with a species that viewed peace as the brief pause between wars. That night, Stone stood on the balcony of her quarters and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Ravagers were consuming another world, adding its resources to their growing fleet. The Kethmori were still trying to understand them, still analyzing their tactics and looking for weaknesses. Stone already understood everything she needed to know about the Ravagers. They were predators, and predators only understood one thing: superior force applied without hesitation or mercy. The Kethmori had been trying to reason with sharks while they were being eaten alive. Over the next few days, more human ships arrived at the Kethmori homeworld. Each one was uglier and more heavily armed than the last, filled with soldiers who looked like they had been born for war. The Kethmori watched them with growing alarm, wondering if they had made a deal with devils to fight demons. Stone received reports from her subordinates about their interactions with Kethmori personnel. The aliens were horrified by human military equipment, disturbed by human tactical doctrine, and terrified by human casualty projections. They kept asking questions about rules of engagement, acceptable losses, and post-war reconstruction. The humans kept giving answers that made the Kethmori wish they had never asked for help. There were no rules of engagement beyond total victory. There were no acceptable losses beyond complete enemy destruction. There was no post-war reconstruction because there would be no enemy left to reconstruct from DOP as the human fleet prepared to move toward the front lines. Stone received a final briefing from High Commander Veltar. He tried one more time to explain the importance of maintaining galactic law, of showing restraint in the face of provocation, of proving that civilization could triumph over barbarism. Stone's response was simple and direct. "Commander, You asked us to save your civilization? We're going to do that. But when this is over, you might not recognize what we've saved it from. The Ravagers hit the border system of Helix 7 expecting another easy victory. They had devoured 18 Kethmori fleets with methodical efficiency, adapting to every strategy and weapon the aliens could deploy. Their hive mind had cataloged every tactic, analyzed every weakness, and prepared counters for every possible response. They were the perfect enemy, learning from each encounter and becoming stronger with every battle. Commander Lisa Torres watched from the bridge of the UES Retribution as the Ravager swarm emerged from hyperspace. There were hundreds of them, each ship a writhing mass of organic technology that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. They moved in perfect coordination, their hive mind controlling every vessel like fingers on a hand. The Kethmori observers aboard the human ships were already calculating retreat vectors, preparing for the careful withdrawal that had become standard procedure when facing the Ravagers. Their remaining fleets would fall back in good order, preserve their strength, and analyze the battle data for future engagements. It was the sensible thing to do, the civilized thing to do. Torres had different plans. The human fleet broke formation. Immediately, scattering in all directions like a pack of wolves released from their leashes. There were no neat battle lines, no coordinated attack patterns, no careful preservation of forces. Some ships dove straight into the center of the Ravager, swarmed, their weapons blazing. Others retreated to the system's edge, disappearing behind asteroids and moons. A few simply charged directly at the largest enemy vessels, their intent clearly suicidal. The Ravager's hive mind paused, processing this unprecedented behavior. In all their encounters with the Kethmori, the aliens had followed predictable patterns. They formed defensive formations, concentrated their firepower, and attempted to minimize their losses while maximizing enemy casualties. They fought like they were playing a game with rules. The humans were not playing by any rules the Ravagers understood. The UES Hammer rammed directly into a Ravager cruiser 3 times its size, its hull cracking as it drove deep into the organic vessel's core. Instead of attempting to withdraw, the human ship detonated its entire payload of nuclear weapons from inside the enemy vessel. The explosion tore both ships apart, but the Ravager cruiser's death throes damaged 5 more enemy vessels. The Ravagers quickly adapted, recognizing the ramming tactic and adjusting their formations to prevent it. But the humans had already moved on to something else. The UES Tornado began broadcasting what sounded like poetry, its captain reciting coordinates with the rhythm of ancient verse. The Ravagers initially dismissed it as psychological warfare, something they had encountered before. Then they realized the coordinates were targeting solutions for the human ships that had retreated to the system's edge. Those vessels had been turning asteroids into kinetic projectiles, using the system's debris field as ammunition. The poetry was a targeting system, a way of coordinating attacks that the Ravagers' analytical minds couldn't easily decode. Chunks of rock the size of city blocks began slamming into Ravager vessels at significant fractions of light speed. The impacts were devastating, turning sophisticated bioships into expanding clouds of organic debris. The Ravagers tried to adapt, but how do you defend against an enemy that turns the battlefield itself into a weapon? The battle raged for 14 hours, longer than any previous engagement with the Ravagers. The alien hive mind was struggling to process tactics that seemed to prioritize destruction over survival. Human ships continued fighting even after taking damage that should have forced them to retreat. Captains rammed enemy vessels with ships that were already crippled, turning their own destruction into weapons. Torres watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction. The Ravagers were learning, adapting, countering every strategy the humans employed, but they were learning too slowly. Human tactics weren't based on careful analysis and optimal responses. They were based on chaos, improvisation, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. The UES Aurora had lost its main weapons and most of its crew, but its captain continued broadcasting targeting coordinates in verse. The ship's computer had been damaged, so the remaining crew was calculating firing solutions by hand, passing them to other vessels through poetry that doubled as code. It was insane, inefficient, and completely unpredictable. The Ravagers tried to jam the broadcasts, but the humans switched to light signals, laser pulses, and even debris patterns to communicate. When the Aurora finally exploded, its captain's last transmission was a haiku that contained the targeting data needed to destroy the Ravager command ship. As the battle entered its final phase, the Ravagers realized they were experiencing something they had never encountered before: uncertainty. They had expected to lose some ships, perhaps even a significant portion of their fleet. But they had also expected to learn from the encounter, to adapt and become stronger. Instead, they were learning that their enemies didn't follow patterns that could be analyzed and countered. The humans fought like they were willing to die as long as they could take their enemies with them. They used tactics that made no sense from a strategic perspective, but were devastatingly effective in practice. The Ravager fleet broke off the engagement after losing 60% of its vessels. For the first time in their history, they retreated not because they were implementing a strategic withdrawal, but because they were afraid. The hive mind had encountered something it couldn't understand, couldn't predict, and couldn't defeat. Through adaptation alone, Torres surveyed the aftermath from her damaged bridge. Half the human fleet was gone, reduced to debris and radiation. The casualty rate was enormous, higher than any engagement the Kethmori had ever fought. By galactic standards, it was a Pyrrhic victory at best, but the Ravagers were gone, and that was what mattered. The Kethmori observers were horrified by the losses, unable to understand how the humans could consider such devastation a victory. They had never fought a war where the goal was complete enemy destruction rather than negotiated peace. They couldn't comprehend a species that would sacrifice half its forces to eliminate a threat entirely. Torres tried to explain it to them, but the concepts didn't translate well. The Kethmori thought in terms of acceptable losses and strategic withdrawals. Humans thought in terms of total commitment and absolute victory. The difference wasn't just tactical, it was philosophical. The Ravager's hive mind analyzed the battle data for days, trying to understand what had happened. They had faced an enemy that fought without regard for their own survival, that used tactics which made no logical sense, that seemed to prioritize causing maximum damage over achieving strategic objectives. For the first time in millennia, the Ravagers felt something they had never experienced before: fear. Not the fear of death, which they had long ago conquered, but the fear of facing an enemy that couldn't be understood, predicted, or defeated through conventional means. The humans had won the battle, but more importantly, they had proven that the Ravagers could be beaten. The cost had been enormous, but it was a cost the humans were willing to pay. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes the price of victory was higher than the price of defeat, but victory was still preferable to extinction. As the human fleet regrouped and prepared for the next engagement, Torres filed her report with a single line that would become famous throughout human military history: "Enemy can be defeated, send more ships." The Ravagers responded to their first defeat by doing what they had always done: they adapted. Their hive mind analyzed the human tactics, identified patterns, and developed countermeasures. They reinforced their hulls against ramming attacks, deployed jamming systems against human communications, and prepared defensive formations that would minimize damage from kinetic bombardment. But the Ravagers were adapting to fight an enemy that operated on logic, and humans didn't always operate on logic. They operated on something far more dangerous: creativity born from desperation and fueled by a species that had spent thousands of years finding new ways to kill each other. Colonel David Kim proved this point when he led a boarding party onto a Ravager hive ship using a tactic that shouldn't have worked by any reasonable standard. The enemy vessel was the size of a small city, protected by adaptive armor and defensive systems that had been designed to counter every known form of attack. It was supposed to be impregnable. Kim's solution was to attach his transport ship to the hull and cut his way in with mining equipment. The Ravagers had sophisticated defenses against military boarding craft, energy weapons, and conventional explosives. They had no protocols for dealing with humans who used industrial cutting tools to break into their ships like burglars breaking into a house. The hive mind had prepared for sophisticated infiltration tactics, not what amounted to breaking and entering with power tools. Kim's team carved their way through 3 decks of the hive ship before the Ravagers could even respond. By the time the alien defense systems activated, the humans were already inside the ship's core, planting explosives in areas that weren't supposed to be accessible to enemy forces. The resulting explosion gutted the vessel from within, something the Ravagers had thought impossible. Meanwhile, Dr. Rachel Park was conducting her own research into captured Ravager technology, and her discoveries were disturbing even by human standards. The aliens weren't just consuming resources for fuel or raw materials. They were learning from every battle, every encounter, every species they encountered. Each engagement taught them something new about their enemies. The Kethmoris' defeat had been inevitable, not because they were weak, but because they were predictable. They fought the same way every time, using the same tactics, the same weapons, the same strategies that had worked for thousands of years. Against a conventional enemy, this consistency was a strength. Against the Ravagers, it was a fatal weakness. Park explained her findings to the increasingly disturbed Kethmori leadership. The Ravagers were like a computer virus that became stronger with each system it infected. Every battle they fought made them better at fighting the next one. They absorbed not just the resources of their victims, but their knowledge, their tactics, their very essence. But humans, Park pointed out, didn't have this problem. They didn't fight the same way twice if they could help it. Sometimes they didn't fight the same way twice in the same battle. Human military doctrine was based on unpredictability, on the ability to adapt faster than the enemy could counter. The Kethmori found this revelation more terrifying than the Ravagers themselves. They had built their entire civilization on order, consistency, and predictable outcomes. The idea of warfare as an exercise in creative chaos was fundamentally alien to them. They began to understand that they hadn't just invited humanity to fight their war, they had unleashed something that might be worse than the enemy they were fighting. Colonel Kim's success led to more boarding actions, each one more bizarre than the last. Human troops used everything from construction equipment to kitchen utensils as weapons. They turned maintenance shafts into invasion routes, cargo bays into battlefields, and life support systems into improvised weapons. The Ravagers' hive mind struggled to develop countermeasures for tactics that seemed to have no underlying logic. One human team disabled a Ravager cruiser by introducing a computer virus through the ship's food processing system. Another group used the enemy's own adaptive armor against them, tricking the ship's defenses into consuming themselves. A third team simply filled a cargo hold with farm animals and explosive devices, creating a biological bomb that the Ravagers couldn't analyze or counter. The Kethmori watched these actions with growing horror. They had expected humans to be violent, but they hadn't expected them to be so creatively violent. Every engagement revealed new depths of human ingenuity applied to the art of destruction. It was like watching artists paint with weapons instead of brushes. Dr. Park's research continued to reveal disturbing truths about both sides of the conflict. The Ravagers were indeed learning from every encounter, but they were learning to fight the wrong enemy. They were adapting to counter-logical, predictable opponents, not the chaotic, improvisational force they actually faced. The humans, meanwhile, were becoming more dangerous with each battle. They weren't just fighting the Ravagers, they were studying them, learning from them, and developing new ways to exploit their weaknesses. But unlike the Ravagers, human learning was based on creativity rather than mere adaptation. The difference was becoming clear to everyone involved. The Ravagers learned like scientists, analyzing data and developing optimal responses. Humans learned like artists, taking inspiration from chaos and creating something new from destruction. The Kethmori realized they were watching two different philosophies of war clash in the void. As the human fleet prepared for the next phase of the campaign, reports came in from across the galaxy. The Ravagers were retreating from several systems, something they had never done before. Their hive mind was struggling to process enemies that seemed to thrive on unpredictability. High Commander Veltar requested a meeting with General Stone, hoping to understand the human strategy for the coming battles. Stone's answer was simple and terrifying. There was no strategy, only the willingness to do whatever it took to win. The Kethmori commander pressed for details, asking about rules of engagement, acceptable casualties, and post-battle procedures. Stone's response would be recorded in galactic history as the moment when the galaxy realized what it had unleashed. Commander, we're not fighting a war, we're committing genocide. And we're really good at it. The revelation that humans viewed the conflict not as a war but as an extinction event sent shockwaves through the galactic community. The Kethmori had thought they were hiring soldiers. They had actually summoned exterminators. As the human fleet moved toward the next engagement, the Ravager's hive mind experienced something it had never felt before: uncertainty about its own survival. For the first time in their existence, they were facing an enemy that might be more dangerous than they were. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes the cure could be worse than the disease, but extinction was still preferable to defeat. The final battle was supposed to take place in the Andromeda Nexus, where the Ravager homeworld lurked behind a wall of consumed planets like a spider in the center of its web. The Kethmori had prepared for a glorious last stand, a final clash between good and evil that would determine the fate of the galaxy. They expected heroic sacrifices, noble defeats, and the kind of ending that would be remembered in songs for 1,000 years. Instead, they watched in horror as Admiral Robert Hayes did something that violated every principle of civilized warfare. He announced his intention to commit genocide on a galactic scale. The broadcast went out to every inhabited system in the galaxy, transmitted on frequencies that couldn't be blocked or jammed. Hayes stood on the bridge of his flagship, surrounded by weapons that most species had banned as too horrible to use, and calmly explained that humanity was going to erase the Ravagers from existence. Not defeat them, not drive them back, not negotiate a surrender. Erase them. The Kethmori delegation aboard the human flagship tried desperately to convince Hayes to reconsider. They spoke of the moral implications, the philosophical questions, the damage to galactic civilization if such an extreme action was taken. They begged him to find a more civilized solution, to show mercy even to an enemy that had shown none. Hayes listened to their pleas with the patience of a teacher, explaining simple concepts to children. When they finished, he asked a question that would haunt galactic philosophy for generations. What's more civilized? Accepting defeat with honor, or ensuring your children never have to fight this war again? The human admiral explained his strategy with the calm detachment of someone discussing the weather. The fleet would not attack the Ravager homeworld directly. Instead, they would begin systematically destroying every system the Ravagers had consumed, turning entire star systems into debris fields. They would erase not just the enemy, but their resources, their history, their very possibility of return. The Kethmori were appalled. Such an action would destroy countless archaeological sites, eliminate entire ecosystems, and render dozens of star systems uninhabitable for millions of years. The cultural and scientific loss would be incalculable. They argued that the cure would be worse than the disease. Hayes' response was simple: better a dead galaxy than a consumed one. The human fleet began its work with methodical efficiency. They didn't target the Ravagers directly, but went after their infrastructure, their supply lines, their conquered territories. Every world that had fallen to the alien swarm was systematically destroyed, its resources denied to the enemy forever. The Ravagers tried to stop them, sending fleets to protect their conquered systems. But the humans had learned from their previous encounters. They didn't fight fair battles anymore. They used tactics that were so unpredictable, so chaotic, that the Ravager hive mind couldn't process them fast enough to adapt. Human ships would attack a system, then retreat when the Ravagers responded, only to return and attack a different target. They used decoy fleets, false intelligence, and psychological warfare that the alien hive mind wasn't equipped to handle. They fought like a pack of wolves, never where the enemy expected them to be. The destruction was absolute. Entire star systems were turned into expanding clouds of debris. Planets that had taken millions of years to form were reduced to asteroid fields in hours. The humans used weapons that the Kethmori had never seen before, devices that seemed designed purely to maximize destruction rather than achieve tactical objectives. The Ravagers found themselves in an impossible position. They could adapt to human tactics, but they couldn't adapt to human strategy. The humans weren't trying to defeat them in battle, they were trying to starve them to death. Every resource destroyed was one less tool the Ravagers could use to build their fleets or feed their population. For the first time in their existence, the Ravagers were forced to make a choice between victory and survival. Their hive mind, which had always prioritized expansion and conquest, suddenly found itself calculating the cost of continuing the war against the benefit of retreat. The moment of decision came when the humans destroyed the Kethshari system, turning what had been the Ravagers' primary shipyard into a cloud of superheated gas. The alien hive mind realized that the humans were willing to destroy everything, including themselves. To achieve their objectives, the Ravagers had faced many enemies over the millennia, species that fought bravely and died honorably, but they had never faced an enemy that seemed to take pleasure in mutual destruction, that viewed the complete annihilation of both sides as preferable to partial victory. The retreat began quietly, with individual Ravager ships simply disappearing from contested systems. The hive mind didn't announce its decision, didn't send demands for negotiation, didn't attempt to secure terms for surrender. The aliens simply began pulling back from human space, abandoning conquests that had cost them tremendous resources. To achieve, the Kethmori couldn't understand what was happening. They had expected the final battle to be a climactic confrontation between two mighty fleets, with the fate of the galaxy hanging in the balance. Instead, they watched the Ravagers simply leave, retreating into the dark space between galaxies, from which they had come. Admiral Hayes watched the enemy withdrawal with grim satisfaction. He had achieved something that the Kethmori's sophisticated military had failed to accomplish in 6 months of fighting. He had made the Ravagers afraid. Not afraid of death, but afraid of facing an enemy that refused to lose. The human fleet began its journey back to Kethmori space, leaving behind a trail of destroyed systems and a galaxy that would never be the same. The Ravagers were gone, fled back to whatever dark corner of the universe had spawned them. But their defeat had come at a cost that most species would consider too high to pay. Ambassador Theron met with Admiral Hayes when the human fleet returned to the Kethmori homeworld. The alien diplomat had prepared a speech about gratitude and eternal friendship, about how humanity had saved galactic civilization from destruction. But when he saw the Admiral's cold eyes and scarred face, the words died in his throat. Hayes' report was brief and direct. The Ravager threat had been eliminated, their fleets destroyed or scattered, their conquered territories rendered uninhabitable. The galaxy was safe from their influence for the foreseeable future. The mission was complete, but Theron realized that something fundamental had changed. The humans hadn't just defeated the Ravagers, they had redefined what it meant to fight a war. They had shown that civilization was not about restraint or mercy, but about the willingness to do whatever was necessary to survive. The galaxy had been saved, but at a cost that would take generations to understand. The Kethmori and their allies had called for humanity's help in their darkest hour, and humanity had answered. But they had answered as humans, not as the civilized beings the aliens had hoped to hire. As the human fleet prepared to return to Earth, Theron asked the question that would define galactic politics for centuries to come. What do we do with the humans who saved us? The answer would determine whether the galaxy had been saved or simply conquered by a different kind of monster. The Ravagers were gone, but humanity remained, and the galaxy was beginning to understand that sometimes the cure could be more dangerous than the disease.